What's going on, everybody? This is Nick Gomez Cologne,
This is Nikos Myrogiannis Koukos.
and welcome to episode 1 of Out of This World, a deep analysis of the planets by Holst. So, what Nikos and I are going to be doing in this podcast is going through each of the individual movements of this large scale work. We're going to be going through some of our observations as listeners and going to be talking about the deeper meaning of the work. You want to add anything, Nikos?
So, one of us is a composer, and the other one is a choral conductor. I'll let you pick who is who. And so we have different points of view, different entry points into the music. So we're gonna essentially, we don't want to recite what has been already written, said about those things. Of course, we've read some of them, if not all of them, but it's about our specific ideas and how we perceive the music and how we perceive the relationship of the score and the music with the titles and the deeper meaning of the work as a unified suit.
Yes, exactly. And how this is going to work for each individual episode is obviously Nikos and I have heard the piece before, and we've done our own time to kind of analyze it and kind of really get a deeper understanding ourselves. But what we're going to do for every episode is right before we start recording, we're going to listen to the work again, just so we can kind of get it as a refresher and then be able to share our points with you. So, Nikos, tell me a little bit about, since this is the first episode, tell me a little bit about what you found out about this piece and kind of lead us into one of our first topics, which is the titles of the movement and the title of Mars, the Bringer of War.
Okay, so our composer is Gustav Holst. Gustav Holst was a British composer of the early 20th century. He wrote this suite between 1914 and 17, and the score we have published, case in point, is from 1921. So that's an original. And so he was very much into astrology and the planets. So not only astronomy, not only the structure of the solar system, but also in ideas and things that had to do with how each planet has a specific character, like a unique mood, a unique character, like astrological shape and character. So he was talking with other composers, other British composers, and he was reading a book talking about those kinds of things. Of course, he omitted some things like the role of the sun and the moon, and he structured the planets in a specific order that it made sense to him as a composer, and then he assigned a subtitle for each planet. So, for example, he starts with Mars, the Bringer of War. So he's starting with the planet Mars, and he assigns the title the Bringer of War. Now, out of those 7 movements, the suite has 7 movements. 2 of them are directly taken from the book. Some of them are his ideas. The Bringer of War is probably his idea. It really helps that Mars as a god was the god of war. So that's probably what gave him the idea about that.
Yeah, thank you, Nikos, for sharing all that. That was some really informative stuff. And it's actually funny, as we were listening to this piece right before starting this episode, Nikos made a joke to me about how this movement in particular sounds just like Star Wars, like some type of battle scene that you'd see in a Star Wars movie. And it's really interesting to see how Holst kind of encapsulates that. So we just kind of jump right into some of the bigger topics of why we think he captures that sense of the bringingness of war. So for those of you who haven't heard the piece, again, these are some of our thoughts, but definitely we recommend you listen to the whole work in its entirety. It's absolutely astounding. So, the Bringer of War opens with a very march-like entrance, where many of the instruments, being the strings and the low brass, they're at a low tessitura, emphasizing a low G, over and over again in a 5/4 pattern that goes like yum bum 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 yum bum 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 bum. And already, with this seriousness in the low tessitura and the low rhythm, we have this sense of seriousness that kind of catches our attention, especially being the first movement of the work. So right out of the silence, the conductor raises their baton, and we're brought on with this serious feeling. Now, one thing about this movement I really want to talk about, in terms of encompassing that seriousness factor, is actually the chord choices that Gustav Holst uses. For a lot of the chords in this movement in particular, he builds them on an A flat, a D natural, and a G flat. So essentially here he's building dissonant chords built off of a tritone and then a non-dissonant interval. So it's interesting how he kind of like puts that together.
Yeah, what essentially he is building chords that are non-diatonic, at least in the traditional way, and that gives him the opportunity to create a sense of awe, like to scare, I guess, the audience. I guess that's his purpose. The war is something scary. It's important to point out that at the moment that this was written, the First World War was taking place over Europe, across Europe, and so. He starts with those beautiful chords, and then he starts like with the low brass instruments, double bassoon, and then it goes all to the horns, and then the trumpets, and there is a sense of climax right away. So the war is essentially menacing. I guess 5/4 is menacing. It's menacing for the conductor to conduct it properly. I will tell you that. And the use of percussion all over the movement, and the use of more and more instruments, and the final induction, like introducing the string instruments, the first violins, the second violins in very high registers, contribute to that climax. But the ostinato in those instruments remains for the biggest part of the piece, which I guess is a metaphor for like a march or something, like it is a menacing march, like something that comes straight out of the unknown.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring up the 5/4, Nikos, because that's actually one of the very first things, and probably one of the most important things to me about this movement. It's the time signature, because one like big topic that I'm going to be referring to a lot over the course of this entire podcast is what Holst does to create an alienated sound. So obviously, aliens are of course associated with space and with the planets themselves. So for me, a really big part of like analyzing this entire work is finding the narrativity of that alienation. What does he do to create an alienated sound? And I think the 5/4 is what he uses in this particular movement. Another thing that really stuck out to me is when he's not using like dissonant chords, he's really just using a lot of chords with open fourths and fifths. This is really interesting to me because, an open fifth to me obviously creates a really serious, bold kind of sound. But at the same time, it also creates a hollow sound because that middle note that usually provides the identification of that chord is missing. So we just have this hollow sound. Perfect fourth even like alienates that even more because the perfect fourth, I'm not sure if you knew this, Nikos, the perfect fourth is the only interval that's not found anywhere in the harmonic series.
Wow.
So not only is it not found in the harmonic series, not found in the overtone series, so it's a very awkward interval that's always meant to resolve up or down depending on which way you want to look at it or depending on what you're doing in voice leading. So it's interesting to me how he takes advantage of these fourth and fifth intervals sporadically throughout the piece to create a hollow yet serious sound that's also alienated in and of itself.
So essentially, let's talk about the structure now, because it feels that the piece is in a ternary form, like an A-B-A prime structure.
Right.
You could advocate, and there are some people that advocate for a sonata form. What essentially happens is that we hear those beautiful fourths, those structures with the ostinato in the beginning. That's our introduction. We also hear those beautiful half steps, that beautiful brass sound, which is then it then gives its place to the also chromatic, but moving faster and moving closer to, I guess, the target, which is the enemy. It's also very menacing. It's also very alienating in the sense that there is always a sense of, okay, where are we in terms of tonality? Is there a tonal is there a key center? And perhaps war, like this could be a metaphor for war being such a destructive like thing in life, like such an destabilizing factor that is just shredding apart everything that we hold to be true and we hold to be dear to us. And, it's just like marching upon our very souls, I guess. So that kind of form brings us to a very specific narration, and the way those episodes are conceived were mostly meaning to talk about the metaphor, comparing the music itself to the title. But I guess that as we were listening to this music again and again, preparing for this beautiful episode, we found out there is kind of a specific story behind this. Is that right?
Yeah, I think there definitely is a story. And before we kind of touch on that, I do want to like bring attention to one thing that Nico said. So one thing, another aspect of this piece that really stands out to me as its own individual movement is actually the ending. So if you look at the very last page of like the score, which this score is available for anyone to look at for free online. In the last page of this movement, we have this big rallentando al fine, so basically slowing down dramatically until the ending of the piece. But what's interesting about that is we have these big orchestral hits throughout the brass and the strings and the percussion all working together. The strings don't play really at all for the entire, or not the strings. The woodwinds don't play really at all for the entirety of the ending. What's interesting about that is technically it's marked as a rallentando, but I feel that it's almost a creative decision to take advantage of the rests in between those, because Holst has specific rests marked in between each of like those orchestral hits, and leaving almost that sense of uncertainty. So not only do we hear that sense of uncertainty in the music, but we also have that sense of uncertainty in the rhythm. And kind of going what you were saying about how this was written around the time of World War One, like it definitely like captures that sense of like not knowing what was happening if you were not actively participating in the war. You know, you're just shrouded in this sense of uncertainty. All of a sudden, things happen, and it's a big deal, and you're gonna hear about it. But then you have rest in between, so you have no idea what's going to happen next. It's interesting how like Holst did a lot of like text and world painting, and incorporated that into his piece.
So there's some kind of late romantic elements into the music, although the language, like the vocabulary that he's using as a composer, is very radical for the time and the place, like for the United Kingdom at that time. However, there is nothing romantic and idealistic about the idea of war, and probably the biggest connection between the music and the subtitle is that war is something that is terrifying, and as Nick said, the ending of the piece makes attempts to make sure that we all get it. That pum 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 pum. That kind of sound is like we are beaten, or we are in a place that is ambiguous and we are terrified to our soul. And if you go back to the middle of the piece, there is some kind of like retransition back to the A prime section, which is actually in 5/2, and then we have a very piano moment with the strings and the woodwinds and all that. Yeah, that's it. And so that's the sense of the battle was lost, or that we are so discouraged and tired in the middle of the piece, and then right away with the triple forte, the menace of war returns with the ostinato, with the 5/4, with more instruments, and with trumpets this time also joining the ostinato. And Nick, could you tell us a little bit about the beautiful fanfare that's like between the tuba and the trumpet? Do you know that? Check this out.
Wait, what was that one more time?
It was in the middle of the A section, going to the B section. It was a beautiful fanfare with the triplets.
Yes, I remember.
Yeah, that one.
Yeah. It's interesting, like, the effects that he has going on there, because he also takes advantage of not only the full ensemble and full sections playing those motions, but also incorporating those with, like, soli, whether it's a tenor tuba solo, whether it's a trumpet solo or a duet. Clearly, like, not only does he embody the sense of war by, like, the choice of instrumentation, but he understands that these are loud, blaring instruments that no matter what dynamic they're playing, they'll always be heard above the orchestra. And combined with, like, the integration of those harsh intervals that we talked about a little bit earlier, he really creates that sense of, like, boldness, and also that sense of, like, the sense of uncertainty, but also the sense of, like, fear in a way that, you know, in something like this, you don't know what the outcome or the result is going to be. You just kind of have to keep pushing and keep fighting towards it. And then when he reaches that 5/2 measure, he really gets that sense of like, oh, we've lost, because we've had this first big, thick chord that we haven't heard at all prior to that. Because everything else was very staccato, very marcato in a sense. Now, of course, we do have like the chromatic lines that like dee, 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 dee. But like that first 5/2 chord, I think is the first like thick orchestral moment that the orchestra will experience in the entire work.
Right. So there is kind of that blurry like moment with those duets,
Mm-hmm.
and it's just like two individual screaming voices above everything else, as you said. And this, I think, is intentional. It's so funny that you brought that because I was thinking about that, and I was like, I mean, it's obviously very well written in terms of counterpoint and as two separate lines, and in the context of the entire score. But at the same time, it's even like on the verge of being sarcastic of war, like two trumpets, like oh, you could say almost like two generals or two like politicians shouting like "Go fight" or
Right.
something like that.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and it's interesting that you bring that up. I actually had not yet I had yet to think about it from that perspective. It's interesting how he creates various characters and how he really creates like almost like a community, and he does that from the get go because right away from the start, like I said, he captures our attention with that 5/4 yum bum 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 yum bum 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 bum. So in a sense, if you think of it in terms of like actual character development, like he's creating a population to respond to those messages. Because one thing that he does in this movement and other movements that we'll talk about in later episodes is the idea of taking a message and spreading it around various sections of the orchestra. Now, of course, for those of you who are familiar with the plans, you'll know that the third movement is literally called the Winged Messenger. We'll get to that when we get there, but um, really he does a great job of like establishing some type of message or motive and then passing it around, almost like a call and response in a way.
And so this was the first movement, essentially. Uh, there is some kind of story. I think we do agree on that, and it's
For
it's
sure.
it's obvious at least after the second reading of the music. There are very specific metaphors. I think from all the seven movements, perhaps the first one is the most obvious, like allusion to something that is happening amongst humans, like war. It's something that we all know, and those people really knew. They have actually experienced in their own hometowns. They had like every family had a soldier abroad, like fighting in France or Belgium. Uh, so the Mars is the bringer of war, and he wants to start with that just to, I guess, like set the expectation for the entire suit, and as Nick said, set some messages, like some subliminal subtexts across the board, all over the place, and then start talking about them. And it's important to see how the first movement is followed by the second one with a totally different name and title.
Yeah, absolutely. And I definitely want to give attention one more thing to Nico said earlier. The time of composition of this was between 1914 and 17. So it's right in the sweet spot of World War One and like what events went down. So really, it's interesting to think that this could have been maybe Holst's response to World War One. Maybe this was his way of musically encompassing how he was feeling or how people were reacting to such a thing. Now, of course, like we like, everyone in history like had experienced war at some point, just with the nature of how history went down. But it's interesting to think of it from the perspective that perhaps this was Holst's response to it, or like how Holst interpreted it, while still allowing for that shred of mystery and that shred of alienation that I brought up earlier as well.
Isn't war alienating itself? Like, could you make a point that war is taking us away from our natural stance and peaceful life? I think that was his point with this first movement, and this is something that we will leave you with, just food for thought, I guess.
Yeah, no, for sure, and like especially like considering recent events that are currently happening within our own nation, like it's interesting to think about it and really kind of gives you a deeper meaning and challenges you as a listener and as like the interpreter to find a deeper meaning of everything. And perhaps this is Holst trying to do that for what was happening at the time. So I guess we'll close with this. One last question I have for you, Nikos, and then I'll kind of
Uh-huh.
give my 2 cents. Um, so obviously we talked about how Holst purposely made his own order for this suite.
Hmm.
He like of course had references to the literature he was reading, but also he still took the time to write and set this entire suite in the order that he did. So Nikos, I'm curious to kind of know what you're thinking. Like what do you think Holst what do you think was the takeaway that Holst was intending for us as listeners to take away from Mars, the Bringer of War? Like, not like connecting it to the other movements, because we'll be doing that as well, but like, what do you think? What do you think he wanted like the big takeaway to be from the first movement?
That things are serious, things are real, everything around us is real, and I guess we're going to talk about that a little more in some other episodes, but life is not all about charm and happy moments and happy thoughts. Sometimes it's about war, sometimes it's about hard feelings, sometimes it's about fear, and starting with that, there you have a scream of war, and then only then he can deconstruct that posture. But for starters, it's something that will catch your attention as an audience, and this will happen in a way that he wants them to understand that this story is definitely not a romantic one, definitely not a happy one, not an idealistic world.
I have to fully agree with you there. And again, we'll be talking and doing connections in later episodes of all the movements together. And we'll talk about how the work ends. We'll talk about the choices that Holst made in connecting these movements and what he potentially could have done to like give them a shared meaning. Who knows? But I think this is our time for now. So thank you all for checking out episode 1 of Out of This World. We will be back very soon with episode 2, where we're talking about the second movement, which is Venus, the Bringer of Peace. So it'll be a stark contrast to this movement. I'm Nick.
I'm Nikos. Thank you so much, friends.
And thanks for listening. We'll be in touch soon.